Hi there, and welcome back to Drimoria. Tonight, I am going to tell you one of Japan's most famous ghost stories, the tale of Hoichi the Earless, a blind musician, a haunted shore, and a promise that went a little too far. If you enjoy these sleep stories, please like and subscribe. It is the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps more sleepy listeners find us. If you feel like sharing, you can tell us where in the world are you listening from and what time is it for you. Thank you for being here and for choosing to spend this part of the night in our small corner of the world. Now, let us begin. If you listen closely, very closely, you can almost hear the water before you see it. It is not the roar of a storm or the angry crash of waves against sharp rocks. It is something quieter, like breath slipping in and out of a sleeping chest. The shore of southern Japan has that kind of sound at night, a slow inhaling and exhaling that seems to belong to the land itself. Long ago, in a time before trains and bright electric signs, before the air was full of other sounds, there was a temple that sat on one of those shores. Lanterns glowed there in the dark, like a handful of small stars brought down to earth, and from the wooden galleries you could look out and see the sea as a single moving sheet of black glass. The temple was called Amidaji, and people said it had been built to soothe the anger of the dead. The story behind that anger was older than anyone living there. Even the elders who shuffled along the corridors with beads in their hands only knew it from songs and stories told by their own grandparents. Once, they said, two great clans had torn the country apart fighting for power. Their banners filled the valleys, their horses churned the roads to mud. Their men died by the tens of thousands. The fighting had gone on for years and years, until it seemed as if the whole world consisted of nothing but armor, dust, and the sound of arrows dropping out of the sky. It finally ended out there on the water, in a narrow strait where the tide runs fast between the islands. Ships met ships. Generals met generals, and in the confusion, a small boy, who also happened to be the Emperor of Japan, was carried in his grandmother's arms and vanished beneath the waves. The sea kept him, and it kept the warriors who followed him, and the people who survived were left with their guilt and their grief and the feeling that the ocean had a memory like an open wound. So they built Amidaji by the shore, and they prayed. They rang bells and chanted sutras and carved names into stone, so that those who had sunk beneath the surface would not be forgotten. Over time, the banners rotted away, and the armor turned to red flakes at the bottom of the sea. The shouts of battle grew fainter in the minds of the living. New generations were born who had never seen a sword drawn in anger. The temple changed with the years. Wooden beams were repaired, gardens were replanted, and the people who lived there walked in soft sandals rather than in iron shoes. Yet the sea remained the same. At night, when the wind shifted, some people still thought they could hear more than water. They thought they heard the creak of old oars and the faint echo of drums. Among the monks at Amidaji there was one musician. His name was Hoichi. He had not been born there. He had come as a guest who stayed so long that no one remembered the first day he arrived. There are people like that in the world. They appear quietly at the edge of your life, and before you know it, their small habits define the place like familiar furniture. Hoichi was blind. He had been blind for as long as he could remember, and perhaps that was why no one pitied him. It is easier, somehow, to pity someone who has lost something than someone who has never had it at all. For Hoichi, darkness was not a loss. It was simply the way the world had always been. What he did have was a biwa. The instrument looked simple enough when it lay across his lap, a pear-shaped body of polished wood with a short neck, 4 strings, and a fretboard that bore the marks of 1,000 quiet evenings. In his hands, though, it stopped being an object and turned into something else entirely. When his fingers brushed the strings, it almost seemed as if the biwa were remembering something it had lived through in a previous life. It could sound like a gentle rain on paper doors. It could sound like hooves on a wooden bridge. When he leaned into the music, it could sound like men shouting and steel crashing, and the sea itself trying to climb into the sky. Hoichi was a biwa priest, a kind of wandering storyteller who used music instead of ink. There had been many like him once, small figures shuffling from village to village, with their instruments in their arms and the history of the country stored in their throats. They earned rice and coins by sitting in sunlit courtyards or smoky inns and reciting long tales of heroes and battles. In Hoichi's time, there were fewer of them, but people still remembered what such singers could do. A biwa priest did not just sing. He kept the past alive. He pulled dead men out of the ground for a little while and made them walk and speak and laugh again. It was this that made Hoichi special to the temple. The head priest, an older man with tired eyes and a patient mouth, had once heard him perform in the town. He had stood at the edge of a small crowd and listened to this blind youth, sitting on a cushion before a lantern, chanting the story of the fallen clan in a voice that never faltered, even when it described a child sinking under black water. The old priest had felt his throat close. He had felt his legs tremble. When the performance ended, he had approached the musician and asked where he lived. The answer had been vague and unsteady. Hoichi had no family left, no house of his own, no place that was truly his. So the priest had done the most practical thing. He invited him to stay at Mythology. A musician in the temple would be an ornament, he said, like a fine painting or a bell with a clear tone. Life in the temple suited Hoichi. He did not see the sweeping roofs or the painted gates, but he felt the grain of the wooden corridors under his bare feet and learned where each stone was in the garden by the sound of its silence. He grew used to the rhythm of the days. There was the early morning bell that shivered in the cool air and pulled the monks from sleep. There was the murmur of chants in the main hall, the soft clatter of bowls at breakfast, the slow work in the gardens and storerooms. When he was not needed for chores, he sat in the shade and practiced. His fingers walked the strings of the biwa the way other people walked paths, over and over, until the music became part of him. The temple people accepted him in different ways. The younger novices liked to sit a little distance away when he rehearsed and compete among themselves to see who could listen without crying. Some of them failed quite often, wiping their eyes with their loose sleeves when he reached a particularly bitter passage in the story. The older monks appreciated his music, but were wary of too much emotion. A temple was meant to be calm. They would sometimes tell him gently not to play in the main hall late at night because the statues might listen and feel disturbed. The head priest, though, liked to hear the songs after supper. He would invite Hoichi into his room, light a single lamp, pour a cup of tea, and ask for a favorite episode. Hoichi would tune his strings and begin, and for a while the two of them would live in another time. The tale that people requested most often from Hoichi was the story of the clan that had died in the sea battle. It was called, simply, The Tale of the Heike. There was something about that story that fit his voice and his temperament. It was long and complicated, full of proud men and clever women, sudden reversals of fortune, and the slow grinding wheel of karma. At its heart were the people of the Tyra clan, who rose very high and then fell very low. They moved like a bright comet across the sky of their age, and then the sea swallowed them. When Hoichi sang of them, he seemed to feel both the pride and the fall, as if they were things happening in his own life. His chant rose and fell, sometimes almost a whisper, sometimes so fierce that the lamp flame trembled. Some nights, after a particularly intense performance, the head priest would sit silently for a long time before speaking. Then, in a low voice, he might say something about the way the world turns, or about how victories contain the seed of defeat. Hoichi would nod, even though he could not always follow the older man's thoughts. For him, the story was more immediate. He lived inside the moment when arrowheads flashed in the sun, when the sea stank of blood and panic, when a grandmother gathered a child in her arms and chose the only ending that made sense to her. The past was not an idea. It was a place he visited with the help of his strings. In this way, the seasons turned. Spring came with its soft green light and the sound of frogs. Summer arrived like a wet blanket laid over the world, making the air heavy and the nights restless. The cicadas sang until they sounded almost mechanical. In the hottest weeks, the monks slept on thin mats with their doors open to catch any hint of a breeze. It was during one of those summers that the strangest part of Hoichi's life began. The evening had been thick and close, the kind of evening where even the crickets seemed tired. The sky was not quite dark yet, just a deep blue fading slowly at the edges. The head priest had been invited to a gathering in town and had left after the evening meal, leaving instructions for the younger monks to be careful with the lamps. Without his presence, the temple felt a little different. It was like a house when the parents are away. People moved more freely, laughed a little louder, and then, as the night deepened, felt a touch of unease at their own freedom. Hoichi ate his simple supper and then carried his biwa out to the veranda that faced the sea. There was a bench there where he liked to sit with his back against a pillar. He could feel the faint movement of air from the water and smell the salt that rose with the tide. Insects buzzed in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then was quiet. The temple around him was settling into its nocturnal shape. Lamps were being put out one by one. Footsteps echoed more softly in the corridors. Voices dropped to murmurs and then to silence. He rested the biwa on his knees and ran his hands over the strings without pressing them, just to feel their smoothness under his fingertips. He was tired from the day, but not sleepy. The darkness behind his eyes felt more spacious than usual, as if it stretched out beyond the temple, beyond the sea, into some unknown country. When he played alone like this, with no one listening, he sometimes let the music wander wherever it wanted to go. Pieces of old chants slid into each other. Fragments of the Heike story merged with tunes he had learned as a child. It was as if all the sounds he had ever heard were stored somewhere inside him and occasionally rose to the surface to sigh. He was about to tune the instrument when he felt the air change. It is hard to describe, but anyone who has spent time outdoors at night knows that there are moments when the world seems to draw a breath and hold it. The insects grew quiet. The distant dog did not bark again. Even the waves seemed to hush themselves. Hoichi sat very still, listening. The boards beneath him creaked softly as his weight shifted. Then, from the gravel path below the veranda, he heard footsteps. They were firm and regular, not the shuffle of a monk in straw sandals. The sound was heavier, with a faint clink that spoke of armor, of metal plates brushing against one another. The footsteps stopped at the base of the steps. For a heartbeat, nothing else happened. Then a voice spoke his name. Hoichi. The voice was deep and controlled, the sort of voice that assumes it will be obeyed. It did not shout. It did not have to. The sound slid across the night air and into Hoichi's ears, as if it had been waiting there all along. He tightened his grip on the biwa without meaning to. Yes, he answered, trying to keep his own voice steady. I am Hoichi. I am blind. Who calls me at this hour in a temple? There was a brief pause, as if the unseen caller were considering how much to reveal. Then the voice replied, now edged with courtesy. I am a retainer in the service of a noble lord. My master is at present in this town on important business. He has heard of your skill with the biwa and your recitations of the tale of the Heike. He wishes to hear the story of the sea battle. It is not fitting for such a man to come to the temple himself. Therefore, he has sent me to bring you to him. Prepare yourself and follow me. Hoichi's first instinct was to protest. There were rules here. The temple gate was usually closed at this time. Visiting the house of a noble in the middle of the night sounded like the beginning of a story, and stories did not always end well for the musician. Yet the habits of many years were stronger than that momentary hesitation. This was a samurai, or at least someone who sounded like one. A man like that was not used to refusal. Besides, Hoichi had been poor for too long not to understand how rare such invitations could be. A single generous patron could change a life. He rose slowly to his feet, feeling for the pillar, and slung the strap of the biwa over his shoulder. His hands shook a little. He tried to calm himself with small practical thoughts. He wondered what kind of house it would be, what sort of audience waited there, whether the floors would be polished boards or cool tatami mats. He worried briefly about whether his robe was neat enough, then decided there was nothing to be done about that now. When he stepped down from the veranda to the garden path, a presence loomed close beside him. A gloved hand, strong and calloused, took his sleeve in a grip that was firm but not rough. The scent of lacquer and metal came to his nose, mixed with the faint smell of horse. There was no sound of an animal, though only the quiet, authoritative breathing of the warrior. Follow, the man said, and Hoichi did. They passed under the open gate and into the town beyond. Hoichi could tell by the sounds that they were taking a route he did not usually walk. The familiar creak of the temple bridge gave way to the hollow tone of different planks underfoot. The air changed too. The sharp salt of the sea faded a little, replaced by the smells of cooking fires banked for the night and the faint sourness of old sake. Somewhere behind closed shutters someone was playing a flute, and the thin melody floated down a narrow alley like smoke. They did not walk for very long, but the turns were many. Hoichi tried to memorize them, counting each change of direction and each difference in the ground beneath his feet, but the warrior's stride was long, and he had to focus on not stumbling. Finally they stopped. The retainer shifted his grip and guided him through a gate that must have been wide and freshly painted, because he smelled the oil in the wood. They crossed a courtyard where his sandals whispered over carefully raked gravel. Somewhere water trickled, perhaps from a small stone basin or a hidden pond. Hoichi became aware of another change in the air. There is a particular atmosphere that gathers wherever important people sit in silence. It is a kind of stillness that is not empty, like the hush before a play begins. As they approached the main hall, he sensed that stillness building. The retainer slid back a heavy door. Warm light washed over Hoichi's face, and with it came the sense of incense, silk, and human bodies in close quarters. "Careful," the warrior murmured, guiding him over the threshold. Hoichi felt the softness of tatami under his feet. The sound of voices, low and refined, brushed his ears and then faded as those present realized that the musician had arrived. He could hear the rustle of fine robes, the small clearing of throats, the faint chime of an ornament as someone shifted position. Several people were arranged in a semicircle around him, he guessed, watching the blind man who had stepped into their presence without being able to see them. He was led to a cushion in what he sensed was the center of the hall. The retainer helped him to kneel and carefully placed the biwa across his lap. For a moment no one spoke. Hoichi could feel eyes on him, many eyes, some curious, some skeptical, some already carrying the weight of sorrow that the story he was about to tell would only deepen. At last, a new voice broke the silence. This one was higher, a woman's voice, but strong and filled with authority. "Hoichi of Amidaji," she said, and the way she used the temple's name told him that they knew exactly who he was. "We have heard that you are the finest living performer of the tale of the Heike. My lord wishes to hear from your own lips the story of the final battle at the strait. You will accompany yourself on the biwa. There is no need to be afraid. We have been waiting for you." The words were kind enough, yet there was something in them that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. It was not threat, not exactly. It was more like the sense one has when stepping into a room where a ceremony has already begun and where everyone else already understands the meaning of what is happening. Hoichi swallowed and bowed his head as deeply as he could. "As you wish," he said softly. "Please forgive any imperfections in my humble skill." He touched the strings with the flat of his hand and felt them tremble under his palm. Then he lifted his right hand, poised the plectrum, and began to tune. The first notes rang out in the hall, thin and pure, and with them something shifted. The air itself seemed to lean closer. Somewhere in the room, a person drew in a sharp breath and then held it. Hoichi finished tuning and sat still for a heartbeat, letting the silence gather. Then, in a voice that belonged more to the dead than to the living, he began to chant the opening lines of the story that had shaped his whole life. The moment the first words of the chant left Hoichi's mouth, the room changed. He could not see the hall or the faces in front of him, but he could feel the way the air leaned closer, the way people shifted, then grew very still. There is a special silence that comes when a story begins, a kind of collective holding of breath. Hoichi knew that silence well. He had learned to feel its shape around him, like the inside of a bell just before the strike of the clapper. He let the first low notes of the introduction roll out of his chest and into the strings, a slow rising pattern that called up the past the way a fisherman pulls up a net. He began with the sound of the bells, not real bells, but a memory of them, the kind that opens the tale of the hike, telling how even the proud must fall, how the blossoms that are brightest are the ones that drop first. His voice carried the rhythm of that old warning. The biwa answered with small, bright notes that hung in the air like petals. He did not rush. A good story has its own breathing. It needs time to wake up. Then, little by little, he led his listeners toward the water. He sang of the long war that had torn the land apart, of banners with crimson suns and white fans, of camps that rose and vanished like morning mist. He named the leaders of the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan, rolling their titles on his tongue with the respect due to ghosts who still had pride. He described how the Taira had once held the court in the palm of their hand, how their daughters were married into the imperial family, how their power seemed like a mountain, steady and unshakable. He did not need to explain, because his audience already knew the story as history. He only had to make them feel it as fate. The music shifted, and the scene narrowed. Now he was at the strait where the tide runs hard between the islands of the inland sea. He made the strings of the biwa creak like ships straining against the current. His thumb struck the strings in short, sharp strokes that sounded like arrows slapping into wooden hulls. He called out the names of the captains on either side as they ordered their men into formation. He spoke of banners rising above the decks, fluttering in the wind, bright with clan colours. He spoke of men who had prayed that morning and joked in the afternoon, and now stood with their feet planted wide, trying to steady themselves against both fear and the rocking of the boats. As he played, the hall around him faded. In its place, he felt the spray of salt on his face, heard the roar of the sea in his ears. He knew this part of the tale so well that he did not have to think about the next line before it came. It rose out of him as naturally as breath. The changing of the tide, the clever trick of the Minamoto, the betrayal of a local pilot who revealed which ships held the emperor and which carried the women of the Taira court. All of it flowed out in a steady stream. He made the sounds of confusion, of men shouting conflicting orders, of oarsmen trying to turn their ships against currents that did not care who ruled the land. His biwa mimicked the crash of hull against hull. A sudden high pluck became the scream of a splintering mast. Rapid tremors along one string became the hiss of arrows in the air. He painted the scene of chaos, white foamy water turning red, bodies falling with heavy splashes that were swallowed almost at once by the hungry strait. He called out the prayers that men shouted as they died, half to Buddha, half to the ancestors who might be listening. Each note he played seemed to push the hall farther away, until all that remained was the battle. As he reached the heart of the scene, his voice softened. The battle continued in the background, but his attention turned to a single boat where a small boy sat, wrapped in layers of silk too heavy for such a slight body. This was the child emperor, the one whose short reign would end at the bottom of the sea. Hoichi drew the picture of the child carefully, with affection and sorrow in equal measure. He told how the boy had not yet learned all the complicated duties of his title, how he still liked simple things, the way the light shone on the water or the sound of a flute in the night. He told of the grandmother who held him and looked out at the ships burning and sinking all around. He gave her a calm, resigned voice as she explained to the boy that the world he knew was ending, that the palace and the gardens and the games were gone, that enemies were closing in from every side. She told him that beyond the surface of the water there was another court, a pure land where he could be emperor forever, free from the dust and blood of human quarrels. Hoichi made her words gentle and steady, as if she were soothing him before sleep. At the same time, the biwa underlined the scene with a darker sound, a low tremor that said as clearly as any spoken sentence that this was a farewell. When he reached the moment where she rose with the child in her arms and stepped onto the rail of the ship, Hoichi slowed almost to a whisper. He let the silence between words widen until he could feel the room leaning in, waiting. Then he let the music drop, a series of descending notes that gave the sensation of falling, farther and farther, into a cold and final embrace. He did not shout. He did not weep. He let the tragedy lie there, quiet and immovable, like a stone at the bottom of the sea. The hall was utterly still. Hoichi could not see their faces, but he felt their grief as a weight in the air. He could hear the faintest sounds, the stifled breath of someone trying not to sob, the rustle of a sleeve hastily brought up to cover a mouth. These were nobles, people who had been trained since childhood to sit straight and keep their expressions under control, yet now their discipline slipped. He felt it. It made his own chest tighten, but he did not let it change the flow of his performance. For a storyteller, tears are not the destination. They are just one of the rivers that run through the journey. He did not end the chant abruptly. Instead, he turned from the drowning and the burning ships to the aftermath, to the way the sea grew calm again, as if tired, and the sky emptied of smoke. He spoke of the bodies washing ashore, of armor catching on rocks, of fishermen finding strange visitors in their nets for many nights afterward. He hinted that the spirits of the Tyra did not leave, that they lingered in the water and in the wind, resentful and restless. Only then did he let the final chord fade away, his fingers resting lightly on the strings to stop their trembling. For a few moments there was no sound in the hall at all. Then, as if someone had given a signal, the audience exhaled in a soft, uneven wave. He heard the delicate clink of ornaments as people shifted. A woman nearby could not hide a quiet sob. Somewhere on his right, a man cleared his throat roughly, the way a person does when he wants to erase the fact that he almost cried. Hands came together in slow, controlled applause, more a gesture of respect than excitement. The woman who had spoken before addressed him again. Her voice was huskier now. "Hoichi," she said, "your performance is beyond praise. Even those who have heard the story 100 times have never felt it as you have made them feel it tonight. My lord is deeply pleased." Hoichi bowed his head until his forehead nearly touched the tatami. "I am honored," he murmured. "If my humble skill has brought any comfort to the spirits of the fallen and to your noble hearts, I am grateful." There was a murmur of appreciation. Then the lady continued, more briskly. "My lord desires that you return here and recite the tale again in full. You will come every night at this same hour and sing all the episodes of the fall of the clan. When the tale is complete, you shall be dismissed with suitable reward. Until then, you must speak of this to no one. My lord is traveling in secret. If it were known that he was here, he would be troubled by many unwelcome visitors. For his sake, you must keep your mouth closed as tightly as if it were sewn shut. Do you understand?" Her tone was still polite, but there was iron under the silk. Hoichi felt a small chill run along his arms. There was something about the way she spoke of secrecy that did not feel like ordinary caution. It felt like a spell settling over him. Still, he knew the proper form of reply. "I understand," he said softly. "I will tell no one." The retainer who had brought him stepped forward, his armor whispering against itself. He took Hoichi by the elbow and helped him to stand. The hall behind them hummed again with muted conversation as they left, but no one addressed him directly. It was as if, having poured out his music and his heart, he had become a vessel that had been used and set aside for the moment. Outside, the night felt cooler. The warrior guided him back through the courtyard. The scent of incense lingered in his nose. When they reached the gate, Hoichi thought he heard the faintest sound of waves crashing close by, much closer than they should have been if they were still in town. But perhaps that was only the lingering echo of his own performance. He felt the retainer's hand tighten briefly on his arm as if in approval, then relax. "You did well," the man said in a quieter voice than before. "Do not fail to be ready tomorrow night. My lord does not give praise lightly." Then came the walk back to the temple. The path seemed shorter now, perhaps because his mind was full. He replayed the performance in his thoughts, analyzing small flaws that no one else would have noticed. His fingers twitched against the smooth wood of the biwa as if they still felt the strings beneath them. When they reached the gate of Amidaji, the samurai stopped. "I leave you here," he said. "Remember the condition, not a word." Before Hoichi could reply, the man's presence was gone. There was the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, then nothing. It was as if the night had swallowed him. Hoichi felt for the familiar lintel of the gate and stepped inside. The temple was quiet, the sort of deep quiet that only comes after midnight. No lamps burned in the outer corridors. Someone, perhaps one of the younger monks, had been thoughtful enough to leave his door unlatched. He slipped into his little room, set the biwa carefully beside his bedding, and lay down. The performance had left him exhausted, yet for a long time he did not sleep. He lay on his back with his hands folded on his chest, feeling the faint tremor in his arms from the hours of playing, picturing in his mind the child emperor and the cold, patient sea. The next day passed in an uneasy kind of normality. At breakfast, one of the novices asked why he looked so tired. Hoichi smiled and said that the heat had kept him awake. It was not entirely a lie. The air in his room had indeed felt thick and hard to breathe. During his chores, he found his thoughts drifting again and again to the strange house and the voices in the hall. He wondered what kind of man this lord was, the one who remained silent while others spoke for him, the one who desired to hear the same tragic story repeated night after night. The head priest returned in the afternoon, cheerful from his visit, and thanked the younger monks for keeping order. He did not notice anything unusual about Hoichi at first. Later, though, when he invited him to play a short piece as he often did, he paused halfway through pouring the tea. "You really do look pale," he remarked. "Perhaps you should rest more in this heat. Do not stay up too late practicing alone on the veranda. The night air is heavy down by the sea." Hoichi lowered his head to hide his expression. "Yes," he said, "I will be careful." When night came again and the temple settled into its breathing sleep, he found his heart beating faster. He sat with his biwa on the same veranda, where the retainer had found him before, and tried to listen with all his senses. Sure enough, as the hour grew late, the sounds of the world seemed to thin out. The insects became a distant hum. The sea drew closer. Then, right on time, came the steady, measured footsteps on the gravel. The second visit was much like the first, and yet it felt different to Hoichi because he knew what awaited him. He let himself be led without protest. The path through the town had the same turns, the same faint smells and distant sounds, but now he could predict them. The gate they entered scraped in the same way. The hall beyond glowed with the same warmth. He could feel the same presence of many people seated and waiting. The lady's voice greeted him, formal but almost familiar now. This time she asked for a different section of the tale, one that told of the earlier triumphs of the Tyra when they were still confident and proud. He played it for them with all his strength. He showed how high they had risen so that their fall would be all the more shattering. Again the audience listened, as if bewitched. Again there were soft sounds of grief and admiration when he finished. Again he was told to return. Night followed night. Each time the retainer came for him at the same hour. Each time Hoichi followed without hesitation, carrying his biwa like a small, shining burden on his shoulder. In the hall, he unfolded more of the epic story. One night he sang of youthful warriors riding into battle with banners streaming behind them, full of dreams and surety. Another night he focused on the inner chambers of the court, where women in layered robes whispered to one another about the changing tides of power. He described the quiet panic that spread when they realized that the fortune of their clan was beginning to slip away, how even the cheer of festivals and music in the palace could not quite cover the smell of fear. He lost himself in these recitations. There were moments in the middle of a performance when he forgot he was a small, blind man kneeling on tatami in a strange house. In his mind he was standing on the deck of a ship, or walking down the polished corridors of the old capital, or kneeling in a shrine lit by 100 candles. The hall became an echo chamber that held the ghosts he conjured. He could feel how hungry his audience was for these visions. It was as if, by his voice, he was cutting a small opening in time, and they were all peering through it. Yet between songs, when the last note had died away and he waited to be told whether he had pleased them, other sensations crept in. Once, as he bowed at the end of an especially intense episode, he caught a faint smell of seaweed and wet stone that did not belong in an inland house. Another time, when the retainer helped him rise, Hoichi felt under his fingers not soft human flesh, but something colder, harder, as if the man were wrapped in layers that were not cloth at all. He told himself that this was only his imagination. It was natural, after all, that singing every night about a battle on the waves would make him smell salt and hear phantom water. At the temple, the changes did not go unnoticed. Hoichi grew thinner and more distracted. He slipped away just before midnight and returned only when dawn was brushing pale light over the horizon. At first, the younger monks assumed he was simply practicing his music in some quiet corner. Later they began to whisper that perhaps he had found a secret patron, someone who rewarded his songs generously. The idea excited them. They imagined that one day a grand carriage would arrive at the gate, bringing gifts for the temple in gratitude for the musician they had sheltered. The head priest was not so easily comforted by fantasies. He saw the dark circles under Hoichi's sightless eyes, and the way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted his teacup. He heard the faint scratch in his voice from singing for hours on end. One evening he asked plainly where Hoichi was going at such a late hour, but the musician only bowed deeply and apologized. "I cannot say," he murmured. "I have given my word." There was something desperate in that answer, something that made the old man's unease deepen. He did not press the question then, but he watched more closely. Nights passed, and the pattern continued. The retainer came, unseen by any but Hoichi, and the blind musician vanished into the dark. Inside the hall by the mysterious shore, the listeners grew ever more rapt in his performances. At the end of each night's recitation, the lady promised that he would not be forgotten, that his faithfulness would be rewarded in a way that would echo long after the tale was done. Her compliments were rich but vague, like incense smoke that fills a room without giving you anything you can hold. For Hoichi, exhausted and flattered and half enchanted by the chance to do the one thing he loved before an audience that truly listened, the days and nights began to blur. The temple, with its simple meals and familiar chores, felt sometimes like the part of a dream that you hurry through to reach the vivid scenes. The dark hall, the waiting nobles, the sea battle unfolding again and again, all of that felt more real. In the end, it was not Hoichi who broke the pattern. It was the quiet concern of a man who had seen too much strange fate in his long life to ignore the signs. One very hot night, when the bell had already struck the late hour and Hoichi had slipped away to sit on the veranda with his biwa, the head priest called two of the most reliable young monks and gave them an instruction that would change everything. The night that changed everything began almost like any other in that heavy summer. The air around Mythology was thick and slow, as if even the wind had grown tired and decided to rest. The sky was a deep, smudged blue with no clear edge between light and dark, and the sea lay beyond the temple like a sheet of metal, breathing in long, quiet swells. Inside the wooden buildings, the monks moved through their usual routines, putting away bowls, trimming the last wicks, checking that the doors that needed to be latched were closed. It was all very ordinary, and perhaps that was why the unease in the head priest's chest felt sharper. Ordinary nights should not make the heart feel as if it had swallowed a stone. He had watched Hoichi drift through the day like someone who had one foot in another world. The blind musician had missed one of the morning chants because he had overslept. He had apologized in that soft, earnest way he had, bowing until his forehead almost touched the floor, and some of the novices had tried to defend him, saying that the heat made everyone sluggish. Still, the old man had noticed the fine tremor in his hands when he took his bowl, the way his voice cracked in the middle of a simple temple hymn. That was not the usual effect of a hot day. That was the sign of someone burning themselves down from the inside. After the evening meal, when the light had seeped out of the sky and the first larger stars dared to appear, the head priest called two of the most sensible young monks to his room. They knelt before him on the tatami, exchanging a quick glance of curiosity. The older man poured them each a small cup of tea, more for the comfort of the ritual than because anyone was thirsty. He let the steam rise for a moment before he spoke. "You have noticed," he said gently, "that Hoichi goes out very late these days." They had noticed. Everyone had noticed. It was hard to ignore the soft brush of his sandals passing down the corridor when most of the temple was already asleep, or the way his room remained empty until the birds were beginning to think about singing. One of the young monks shifted uncomfortably. "Yes," he admitted. "We thought perhaps he was asked to play in town. Some people there like to keep late hours." The head priest sipped his tea and shook his head slightly. "If that were all, he would have told me. There is more to this. He is a good man, but he is bound by some promise. Promises can be chains, especially when we do not see to whom we have tied ourselves." He looked at their faces, pale in the lamplight, then set down his cup. "I want you to follow him tonight," he said. "Not too close. He must not know. Watch where he goes and who he meets. Then come back and tell me everything. Do not speak to him there, no matter what you see, unless you believe his life is in immediate danger. You will know danger when you see it." They bowed their heads, feeling the weight of the task settle on their shoulders. It was one thing to sweep the courtyard or recite a sutra in the main hall. It was another to go out into the dark on a mission that felt like the beginning of a story told in a hushed voice. Still, they were temple men. When the old priest asked something in that tone, refusal was not an option that made sense. Later, when the temple had fallen into its sleepy rhythm, the two waited in the shadows near the veranda where Hoichi liked to sit. From their hiding place, they could see him as a dim shape against the slightly paler shape of the sky, his back straight, the curve of the biwa outlined across his lap. The sea beyond was only a smell and a suggestion of sound. Lanterns had been put out everywhere else. Their own little lamp had been extinguished as well, so that they themselves would not be seen. They watched in the deepening dark as Hoichi sat motionless for a long time, as if listening for something that only he could hear. It came in the form of footsteps. Even from where they crouched, the monks could hear the approach of someone on the gravel path. The sound was wrong for the temple. It was not the light slapping of straw sandals or the careful tread of bare feet. Each step was heavy, with a faint ringing edge, the voice of metal meeting stone. The air, which had been simply warm and dull, seemed suddenly to sharpen like a knife being drawn from a sheath. The footsteps stopped below the veranda. The two hidden monks pressed themselves closer to the wall, hardly daring to breathe. They heard a voice speak, deep and controlled. "Hoichi." They felt, rather than saw, the blind musician stir. The little answer floated back, careful and respectful. "Yes, I am Hoichi. I am blind. Who calls me at this hour in a temple?" The reply was too low for them to catch every word, but they heard enough. Something about a noble lord. Something about an invitation. Something about secrecy. The voice was polite, but there was an edge in it that made the hairs on the backs of their necks rise. They heard the faint shift of Hoichi's robes as he got to his feet, the soft scrape as he picked up his biwa. Then a gloved hand, invisible to them in the dark, took his sleeve. The monks let a small gap open between themselves and the veranda and watched Hoichi step down onto the ground, guided by a tall shadow that made almost no sound as it moved except for that light, unmistakable clang of armor. The pair passed within a few arm lengths of their hiding place. In that brief moment, one of the monks caught a strange scent, not quite like iron and not quite like seawater, but something in between, like rain on old stone that has seen many funerals. They waited until the sound of the footsteps faded down the path. Then they crept out and followed at a distance that felt both too close and too far. The moon was thin, a shy sliver behind a veil of cloud, but they knew the layout of the grounds and the town beyond. They moved quickly, but tried not to let their sandals whisper too loudly. At first they assumed the mysterious retainer was taking Hoichi into town, to some noble house where the doors were still open and lanterns still burned. Indeed, the first turn did lead toward the houses. They could smell cooking fires and hear the faint, sleep-thick voices of drunk men singing off key behind closed shutters. A dog barked once and was hushed. Somewhere a baby cried, then subsided as a mother bent over it. But then, at the edge of the usual streets, their quarry turned again, not toward the heart of the town, but toward the sea. The young monks looked at each other and followed more cautiously. The road narrowed to a path. The sound of the waves grew fuller, rolling against the shore with a steady, hollow slap. The smell of salt grew stronger. They knew where this path led. It did not end at a house. It ended at the graveyard. The cemetery of Amidaji was not far from the water. In daytime it was almost peaceful, with rows of stone markers standing like students in an unusually disciplined class, each one carved with careful characters. Some had small offerings at their base, a cup of sake, a flower, a coin. Others were bare, their names slowly fading under the long fingers of moss and forgotten rain. There was a line of larger monuments near the front that had once been painted, though time had peeled the colour away. These taller stones belonged to people of rank. Among them were the mounds raised for members of the Taira clan who had been pulled from the sea after the great battle. Their graves faced the strait, as if the dead still watched the water that had taken them. At night, the graveyard was a different world. The stones became hunched shapes in the half-light, and the paths between them turned into narrow corridors where the air felt thick and close. The two monks had walked there in daylight many times, chanting passages of scripture for the souls of the departed, but they had no desire to do so now. Still, their task pulled them onward. They flattened themselves against the shadows near the entrance and watched. The retainer led Hoichi straight through the gate, without hesitation, as if this place too were a noble hall. They walked past the first lines of stones, deeper into the clustered mounds. Finally, they stopped near one of the larger monuments, where the ground sloped gently down toward the shore. There was a simple stone bench there, half worn and a little tilted. It was the sort of place where someone might sit to rest after a long climb from the water. In the grey smear of the night, the monks saw Hoichi lower himself calmly to the bench. He turned his face slightly toward the sound of the sea, as if acknowledging someone seated there. The tall figure beside him stepped back, perhaps to stand guard. There was no house, there were no lanterns, there were only the leaning shapes of stone and the mutter of the tide. For a moment, the watching monks thought perhaps they had been mistaken, that this retainer was only a strange, solitary man with his own habits, that he simply liked listening to music among the graves. It was an odd thought, but not impossible. Then the lights appeared. They did not come from any lamp or torch. They were small and round, like fists, and they floated up one by one from behind the stones. Their colour was wrong, a pale greenish-white with a faint blue edge, like the light you see deep in a winter ice cave. They bobbed gently in the air, as if lifted by some slow underwater current. Some rose only a little, hovering just above the tops of the markers. Others climbed higher, swaying above the path. They made no sound. They cast no shadows that the monks could see, yet their presence soaked into the night. The young monks had heard about such things in stories. Old fishermen sometimes spoke of ghost fire that danced above the waves on certain nights when the tide was right, or of lights that wandered in the rice fields without any bearer. The old priest had warned them in lectures that the world held more than what could be measured by the eye. But hearing such things in a story and seeing them rise in front of you are different experiences. Their mouths went dry. One of them gripped his beads so tightly that the string cut into his palm. The lights gathered around Hoichi. They floated in a rough circle, as if forming an audience. They illuminated him faintly, enough that the monks could see the white of his face and the curve of the biwa across his lap. They saw his lips move, as if in conversation. They saw his hands rise, sure and unhurried, to touch the strings. Blind as he was, he gave no sign of distress. He seemed completely at ease, as if this glowing crowd were the most natural thing in the world. Then he began to play. The first low notes slid out across the graves like a tide rolling in. Even from their hiding place, the monks felt the hair on their arms lift. It was the same story he had been telling in the hall, but out here it sounded different. Without walls to hold the sound, his voice floated into the open sky, and the biwa's sharp-plucked tones mingled with the distant rush of the sea. He sang again of banners and oars, of the clash of two clans, of the small emperor and his desperate grandmother. And the lights around him pulsed faintly in time with the music, brightening on the strongest notes and dimming in the pauses, as if breathing with the song. At that moment, one of the monks made the mistake of glancing away from Hoichi to the stone directly behind him. In the eerie, shifting light, he could just make out the carved characters on the monument. The inscription named an emperor, a child of 6, who had drowned in the strait. It was the grave of Antoku, the very boy whose last moments Hoichi was conjuring with every breath. Once the young monk saw that, he could not unsee it. The pieces clicked together in his mind, with a sensation like freezing water poured down his spine. He grasped his companion's sleeve and pointed with a hand that shook. The other leaned close, squinted, and read the name as well. Their eyes widened. They had all learned the story of the battle as children. They knew where the emperor had died, and they knew that some of the bodies had been carried here. They had walked past those stones countless times in the sun. To realize now that Hoichi was sitting before one of them, singing the tale of a life that ended there, to an audience of floating ghost fire, was almost too much. They did not stay to hear the entire performance. Fear, old-fashioned and simple, finally moved their feet. They backed away as quietly as they could, but to their own ears every step seemed to rattle the quiet. The lights did not turn toward them. Hoichi did not falter. The chant flowed on, as if nothing in the world existed but the story and the dead who were listening. When the two monks reached the boundary of the graveyard, they turned and ran, sandals slapping the path, robes flapping, their breath soaring in their throats. By the time they burst into the head priest's room, the old man was already awake. He sat upright, his face lined and calm in the lamplight, as if he had known they would come. When he saw their expressions, he poured tea for them without asking any questions at first. Only when their hands had stopped trembling did he speak. "Tell me," he said softly. The words spilled out in a jumble. The footsteps, the voice on the veranda, the walk through the sleeping town, the sea-smelling path, the graveyard, the lights, the inscription on the stone. Hoichi sitting there, as if nothing were strange, playing for an invisible lord who must, by any reasonable measure, be long dead. As they talked, the young monks watched the head priest's face, hoping for some sign that he disagreed, that he would tell them they had misread the situation. There was no such comfort. His mouth grew thinner. His eyes took on a depth that came, not from surprise, but from recognition. "I feared something like this," he said at last. He did not speak as if he were talking about gossip or village curses. He spoke as someone who had studied not only sutras, but the old rumors that hung around the edges of recorded history. He rose slowly and went to the small altar in the corner of his room, where a statue of Amida Buddha sat in calm repose. The old man lit incense with steady fingers. The smoke curled up and spread, softening the brightness of the lamp. "You have both heard the stories," he continued, his back turned to them. "The sea out there does not hold only water, it holds regret. So many men died in that strait. They died suddenly and with their minds filled with anger and confusion. Those are the conditions that make ghosts." The monks nodded, though he could not see. They had heard fishermen talk of strange whirlpools that appeared on calm days, of voices that called from the waves in the tones of long-dead relatives. They had heard of small crabs with markings on their shells that looked like sorrowful human faces, creatures said to be the transformed souls of the Taira warriors who still clung to their old anger. The temple itself had been built because people feared that without proper prayer and remembrance, disaster would come again and again from the water. "The dead of that battle are not at peace," the priest said. "They have not finished listening to their own story. When they hear someone tell it as Hoichi does, with such heart they gather. They want to hear again the lives they lost. They want to know that someone remembers their names." He turned back to them, his eyes dark. A living man should not be among them for too long. The bonds that tie him to this side of the river grow thin. The younger monks shifted, their fear deepening into a more complicated feeling. Concern for Hoichi twisted in their chests. He was not just another member of the temple. He was their friend. He was the one who had filled long rainy afternoons with songs and stories when there was little else to do. The idea of him sitting blind and trusting among ghosts who might, out of loneliness or envy, decide to pull him permanently into their company was unbearable. "What should we do?" one of them asked. "If we tell him, will he believe us? He already promised them he would come back, and they are not like ordinary patrons." The head priest sat down again slowly, as if his bones had grown heavier. He folded his hands in his lap and stared at the smoke from the incense. "We will not ask him to break his promise directly," he said. "That would be dangerous for his soul. Spirits that have been offended can cling like burrs. Instead, we must make it so that they cannot see him, even if he sits in front of them. To do that, we will need more than polite words and concern." He fell silent for a time, reaching back through his own memory. Long ago, when he had been as young as the two in front of him, he had studied not only the bright pages of scripture, but also the darker margins of temple lore. There were stories of monks who had walked through fields haunted by angry kami without being noticed, of priests who had sat in a room full of spirits unseen. The method was always the same: text, sacred text written on the body, turning skin into a wall marked all over with the names of Buddhas and the pattern of truth. At last he nodded to himself, decision settling in. "There is a way," he said, "but it must be done carefully. The scriptures tell us that whoever is entirely covered in certain sutras becomes as a piece of stone or air in the eyes of restless ghosts. They look and see nothing they can hold. We will write the sutras on Hoichi's body. We will wrap him in words. Then, when the retainer comes to fetch him, he will sit here and remain silent. The spirits will call and call, but they will not find what they are looking for." The monks listened, their eyes widening a little at the thought of the quiet musician covered head to toe in sacred characters. One of them voiced a worry. "Will he agree to this? He is afraid, but also loyal. He might think he is betraying them." The head priest shook his head. "We will tell him the truth. It is better to be honest when dealing with both the dead and the living. His loyalty has gone far enough. If he continues to obey them, they may decide that the best way to repay his devotion is to keep him forever. I think he would rather live and sing for those who still breathe." The first faint light of dawn was beginning to stain the windows, a very pale grey. The birds in the trees cleared their throats. Somewhere in the distance the sea sighed one of its long, slow sighs. The old man extinguished the lamp. "Go and rest for a short while," he told the young monks. "We will speak to Hoichi when he returns." They would not have to wait long. When the blind musician came back to the temple that morning, the sand still clinging faintly to the hem of his robes, the head priest was waiting in the main hall. The incense had been lit again. The statue of Amida looked down as it always did, with that strange combination of distance and compassion. "Hoichi," the old man called gently, "come here. We must talk." When Hoichi stepped back into the main hall that morning, the world felt strangely bright to him, even though his eyes had never seen light. The air inside the temple was cool after the heavy outside heat. Incense wound itself in careful spirals around the pillars, as if someone had been whispering prayers to the Buddha for hours. The wooden floor under his bare feet carried the faint chill of the night that had just ended. He was tired in a way that seemed to reach into his bones. His shoulders ached from the weight of the biwa and from the invisible weight of all the dead men he had called up in song. He heard the head priest's voice float across the hall from near the altar. It was calm as ever, but there was a line drawn tight under the calm, a taut string he could almost hear. "Hoichi," the old man said, "come here." The blind musician hesitated for a moment on the threshold. There was something in that gentle tone that made his heart shift uneasily. He walked forward anyway, following the familiar echo of his own steps. When he reached the place where he usually knelt for instruction, he set his biwa carefully down at his side and lowered himself onto the floor. His fingertips brushed the mat, reading its texture like a script. The head priest let the silence breathe for a while, the way a storyteller does before he begins. Outside, a crow cried harshly from the cypress tree, as if impatient. Inside, the statue of Amida Buddha watched without blinking. Finally, the old man spoke. "I have heard," he said, "that you have been going out at night." Hoichi bowed his head. There was no point denying it. "Yes," he answered quietly, "I have. Where do you go?" "That," Hoichi said, and his voice trembled almost imperceptibly. "I am not allowed to say. I gave my word. A noble lord is traveling in secret. I was commanded to keep it so." The old priest sighed. and the sound carried the weight of many years. It was not a sigh of anger, but of someone who has seen a pattern forming for a long time and is sorry to be proven right. "You are loyal," he said. "That is good. But there are some promises that should never have been asked of you, and there are some lords who are not among the living." The words hung in the air like a bell note. Hoichi lifted his head a little, as if he might catch them again and turn them over in his hands. "Not among the living," he repeated slowly. His mouth had gone dry. "When you left last night," the head priest went on, "I asked 2 of the younger monks to follow you from a distance. They did so. They came to me before the sun rose and told me everything they saw." He described it in a soft, even voice that did not try to make the story more dramatic than it already was. The gravel path, the sound of metal in the retainer's stride, the turn not toward town but toward the sea, the entrance to the graveyard, the stone bench beneath the larger monuments, the floating balls of pale fire rising out of the earth, the way they gathered around Hoichi like listeners in a royal theatre. He spoke of the inscription on the great stone behind the musician, the name of the drowned emperor carved there, the flicker of ghost light on worn characters. He told him how his own voice and his biwa had poured the story of the battle into the night for ears that no longer belonged to flesh. While he listened, Hoichi felt something inside him tilt. Until that moment, he had been living in 2 separate halves. There was the temple, with its chores and chants and the familiar shape of the veranda under his hand. Then there was the other world of the night, with the mysterious hall and the courtly voices and the noble lady who praised him and ordered him to return. Part of him had sensed some oddness there, a faint smell of brine in rooms that should not have smelled of the sea, a chill in the air that did not match the heavy summer heat. But he had pushed these things aside. There was a kind of comfort in being needed so completely by an unseen audience. Now that comfort fell away like a robe slipped from his shoulders. He saw, in the darkness behind his blind eyes, not smooth tatami and painted screens, but rows of headstones and a restless sea. He heard again the voices that had praised him, but now they sounded deeper, muffled, as if spoken through water. He imagined faces he had never seen, pale and swollen from the sea, still bearing the traces of old pride. A shudder rippled through him. "So," he whispered, "they were not living people at all. They were the spirits of the Tyra clan," the priest said, "the fallen warriors, the ladies who drowned, the child emperor, all those who died in the strait and were brought here in grief and haste. They have listened to your songs, and they are pleased. That is why they summoned you. That is why they keep summoning you." Hoichi's fingers closed hard on the cloth of his robe. "Then I have done wrong," he said. "I should not have gone." The old man shook his head, though the gesture was lost on the blind musician. "You have not done wrong. You did what any singer would do when called to perform by a powerful lord. The dead can be as convincing as the living. There is no shame in having answered. The danger lies in continuing. Ghosts are clingy listeners. Once they decide that someone belongs to them, they do not give him up easily." A quiet dread settled in Hoichi's stomach, cold and heavy. He thought of the retainer's voice, always exactly the same every night, courteous and unyielding. He thought of the promise he had made to return until the tale was finished. "If I refuse them now," he said slowly, "will they be angry? Will they harm the temple? It is not refusal that will protect you. the head priest replied. Words do not sway souls that stubborn. They will not listen if you simply say, "You will not come." For them the story has not ended. They intend you to sing it until the last drop of your strength is gone, and then perhaps they will keep you as one of their own. We must instead make it so that you are no longer there for them to grasp. They will look straight at you and see nothing they can hold on to. For that we need a different kind of story. We need the story written on your skin. The phrase sounded strange enough that for a moment Hoichi forgot his fear. "Written on my skin," he repeated. There is a practice, the priest explained, mentioned in the older teachings and in some tales that never made it into the formal books. It is said that if one writes certain sutras on every part of the body, covering it as if with armor made of words, then spirits of a vengeful kind lose all power to see that person. Their eyes cannot rest where the sutra rests. They become blind in turn. They cannot seize what is no longer shape but scripture. He rose and walked across the hall to a small chest that sat under a hanging scroll. From it he took a brush, a stick of ink, and a low stone inkstone worn smooth by long use. The quiet sounds of preparation filtered into Hoichi's ears. The rasp of ink being ground with water, the soft tap of the brush handle on the stone, the rustle of cloth as the old man settled himself back on the mat. "If you allow it," he said, "I will write the Heart Sutra and other protective verses over your body. Then, tonight, when the retainer comes, you will sit here in the hall, bare except for the words, and you will remain perfectly still and silent. No matter what he says, no matter how loudly he calls, you must not move or answer. If you do this, he will not be able to find you. He may search the entire temple with his hungry eyes and see nothing but empty air and cold statues. Then he will go back and tell his lord that you are gone. The dead will have to accept that." The thought of sitting alone in the dark while an unseen presence prowled and called his name made a line of ice run up Hoichi's spine. Yet he felt, too, a kind of desperate hope. The alternative was to keep walking, night after night, into the graveyard until his own name was carved on one of the stones. He bowed deeply until his forehead touched the floor. "I will do as you say," he answered. "Please help me. My life has little value, but my music was given to me for the living. I would like to keep playing it as long as I can." The head priest nodded, though once again the gesture meant little. "Then we will begin at dusk," he said. "Eat, rest a little, and prepare your heart. This is a serious thing. Do not speak of it to the others yet. They will stand guard when the time comes. For now, keep your mind steady. Remember that the Buddha sees all beings, living and dead, from a place beyond fear." The day crawled by, thick as molasses, every hour stretching longer than usual. Hoichi tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw a hall lit by cold light, full of faces that were not quite human anymore. He heard a child's voice ask softly why the water was so cold. He tried to play his instrument to steady himself, but his hands shook so much that the strings rang with nervous, uneven notes. In the end, he lay on his mat and counted his breaths, the way he had been taught when he first came to the temple, until they simply turned into an indistinct rise and fall in the darkness behind his eyes. At last evening came, dragging shadows behind it. The sky outside turned a tired purple, then sank into deep blue. Monks moved through the halls, lighting a few lamps, Then, at the head priest's instruction, putting most of them out again. Only the main hall and one small room nearby were left with a gentle glow. The statue of Amida watched the preparations with the same serene half-smile. The head priest called Hoichi once more. "It is time," he said. They took him to the small room next to the hall, where the air smelled of clean wood and ink. There, with only a single lamp to see by, they helped him remove his robe until he sat naked on a folded cloth. The heat of the night made his skin already damp. He shivered anyway, more from the strangeness than from cold. He had never felt so exposed, not even as a child. The head priest knelt beside him with the brush and inkstone. The younger monks stood respectfully just inside the doorway, ready to assist, but careful not to stare more than necessary. The old man dipped the brush into the ink, tested it once on the cloth, then laid the first character on Hoichi's chest. The tip of the brush was soft, almost ticklish, but the wet stroke left a trail of coolness that quickly dried to a faint tightness. He began with the Heart Sutra, the one that speaks of emptiness and form and the way all things are at once solid and insubstantial. He wrote the characters in careful lines, wrapping them around Hoichi's ribs, across his shoulders, down his arms. The ink smelled faintly bitter. Each stroke was a word, each word a small wall in the invisible armor they were building. The old man murmured the text under his breath as he wrote, not as a formal chant, but as a reminder to himself of the meaning contained in the strokes. Hoichi sat very still, eyes closed, breathing shallowly. At first he tried to track where the brush went, mapping the verses across his skin in his mind. After a while, the pattern became too complex, and he surrendered to the sensation. Ink on his back, tracing the curve of his spine. Ink on his belly, circling his navel. Ink around his neck, like a necklace drawn in script. He felt the characters creeping down his thighs, spiraling around his knees, sliding over his shins. From time to time, the brush left a tiny, cool dot where the old priest paused to gather his strength. The younger monks watched, shifting their weight from foot to foot. They had written sutras on paper countless times, but seeing the same shapes unfurl on human skin had a different effect. It made the words feel less decorative and more like tools. They could almost see the fine, invisible threads that would extend from these characters into the unseen places where ghosts drifted. It took a long time. The head priest was meticulous. He did not want to leave any part unprotected. He wrote on the palms of Hoichi's hands, on the soles of his feet, on the tops of his shoulders, where the sun sometimes touched his skin during morning chores. He wrote on his forehead and cheeks. The ink chilled his face and then dried, making his skin feel tight, as if he were wearing an invisible mask. In his concentration, in the blur of bending forward and leaning back, of dipping the brush and drawing character after character, the old man made only one mistake. It was small, almost understandable. Ears are strange things, part of the face yet somehow set apart. They are created to listen, not to carry text. His brush traced the last verse along Hoichi's jaw, and then, exhausted, he sat back on his heels with a sigh of relief, not noticing that the white curves of the ears on either side of that ink-covered face were still bare. He put the brush down and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "It is done," he said. "You are now more sutra than skin. Even the most stubborn ghost should not be able to see you. They helped Hoichi into a plain cotton robe, worn loose so as not to smear the ink. Every movement reminded him that his body carried a second, dark script under the cloth. The characters tugged very slightly as he walked, a faint tugging that made him feel both strange and oddly calm. The head priest led him into the main hall and placed him in front of the altar, facing the Buddha. He guided him to sit on the floor, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. "Remember," he said softly, bending so close that Hoichi could feel his breath on his ear, "you must not move or answer, no matter what you hear, not if he calls you politely, not if he threatens, not even if he shakes the building. Your life hangs on your stillness. Think of yourself as a statue. Think of yourself as a stone in a dry riverbed. The words on you will do the rest." Hoichi nodded once. His throat was too tight to form words. He drew in a deep breath, then another, and found a quiet place inside himself, the place where he went when he played the first notes of a song. He folded himself into that stillness and waited. The lamps in the hall were turned down until the statues and pillars became hulking shadows. The younger monks took up positions just out of sight, ready to watch but not interfere. The head priest tucked himself into a corner where he could see both the main door and Hoichi's silhouette against the dim glow of the altar. Outside, the sky darkened from blue to black. The sea took on the sound it always had at that hour, slow and deep and patient. Midnight is a strange time in any place, but in a temple built to soothe angry ghosts, it has its own thickness. The world feels both more empty and more crowded. As the hour approached, the air in the hall cooled a little, and with that coolness came a faint smell of salt and old weeds from the shore. The head priest held his breath, without quite meaning to. Then, exactly as on the previous nights, came the sound. Footsteps on gravel outside, firm and measured. They crossed the courtyard, passed under the gate, and approached the wooden steps of the hall. There was no sound of hands on the door, but the entrance slid open anyway with a soft scrape. A draught of air moved through the space, making the last thin threads of incense smoke twist. The retainer's presence filled the doorway, tall and heavy. Though no lamp shone on his armor, the old priest could see the outline of shoulder plates and helmet, a silhouette darker than the dark behind it. The unseen man stepped inside, and the hall seemed to grow smaller by half. He looked straight toward where Hoichi sat. The head priest followed his line of sight and felt every muscle in his own body tighten. From where he was, he could see the faint shine of ink on the musician's hands and face, but the robe hid the rest. Hoichi himself did not move. He sat with his head slightly bowed, like a statue carved by a very patient artist. "Hoichi," the retainer called. His voice rang against the pillars. "Hoichi, it is time. My lord waits. Come." Silence. The retainer took another step forward. "Hoichi," he said again, this time with more force. "Do not pretend you do not hear. I know you are here. Answer." Still Hoichi did not move. The words on his skin seemed to tighten, each drawn character a small hand holding him in place. He focused on his breathing, on the rhythm of air in and out, the way he did when he played long pieces. He let the retainer's voice wash over him like wind. The ghostly warrior advanced until he stood almost in front of the altar. His head turned slowly from side to side, as if he were sniffing the air. The head priest, watching, felt a strange sensation. It was as if the retainer's gaze slid over the hall without catching on anything solid. His eyes did not rest on Hoichi. They seemed to glide past him, as if that ink-covered body were invisible, an empty patch of dimness. The retainer muttered, puzzled now, and changed the direction of his search, scanning the corners. He paced along the foot of the altar, his armoured feet making the boards creak. The monks in their hiding places held very still, even though their hearts hammered. From their position they could see the outline of Hoichi no more clearly than before, yet they noticed something the retainer did not. There, in the centre of the hall, where every part of the musician had been wrapped in sutra except two, floated a small, strange sight. Against the dark, just at the edges of the invisible man, two shapes hung in the air without support. They were pale and softly curved, with delicate ridges and subtle shadows. They were the only part of him not covered in ink, the only skin that remained plain and visible. To the eyes of the living, it looked as if a pair of human ears hovered absurdly at about the height of a man's head, unattached to anything, trembling very slightly. The retainer stopped. The head priest saw his helmet tilt. For the first time, the warrior's stance changed from confident to uncertain. "What is this?" he growled softly. He stepped closer. From where he stood, he could see nothing of Hoichi's body, only those two ears, pale in the gloom, like small shells suspended in mid-air. The sutras had worked too well. They had erased everything but the one detail the old man had forgotten. A slow anger gathered in the retainer's voice. "So," he said, "they have hidden you. They have tried to cheat my lord." There was a drawn-out moment in which the hall held its breath. Hoichi felt, more than heard, the warrior standing over him. His skin crawled. Every instinct screamed for him to get up and run, to cry for help, to clutch his head and protect it. But the memory of the priest's instruction held him in place. Do not move, do not answer, be stone, be statue. The retainer reached out. His hand found the air where Hoichi's head should have been and touched nothing. Only the ears were real to his touch. He seized one between his fingers. The flesh was solid, trembling. "You have been ordered to appear," he said in a tone that was now both offended and cruel. "If only your ears are here, then your ears will go in your place. My lord must have some proof that you obeyed." With that, and without another word, he pulled. Pain exploded through Hoichi's world, white and blinding in the darkness that had been his companion all his life. It was sharper and deeper than any cut or bruise he had ever known. It felt as if the side of his head had been set on fire and then torn open. Blood poured warm down his neck, soaking the robe, dripping onto the floor. His body wanted to arch, to thrash, to scream. He did none of those things. He clamped his jaw shut so hard that his teeth ground together. The sutras along his chest and arms seemed to burn, not with pain but with fierce purpose, reminding him that this agony was the price of his life. His fingers dug into his knees until the nails hurt. His breath came in short, harsh bursts, but he swallowed every sound that tried to rise. The retainer, satisfied with the first grisly prize, let the torn ear drop into an unseen pouch and reached for the other. Another wrench, another wave of pain, Another spill of hot blood down the other side of Hoichi's face. The room spun inside his head, though he could not see it. The world narrowed to the roar of his own pulse and the taste of iron in his mouth where he had bitten his tongue. Still, he did not cry out. At last, the ghostly warrior stepped back. "It is done," he said, almost to himself. "My lord will accept these as proof that the blind singer did not fail him. The temple has interfered, but they cannot deny what I carry." He turned on his heel. His footsteps receded across the floor, then down the steps, then along the gravel path. The door slid shut behind him with a final soft thud. The heavy presence that had filled the hall lifted like fog burned away by the sun. Only then did the head priest move. For a few heartbeats after the retainer left, the hall was full of nothing but the sound of blood. It dripped in a soft, uneven rhythm onto the boards in front of the altar. Pat, pat, pat. Each drop making a small dark mark that the Buddha above did not bother to comment on. The incense that had been lit earlier continued its slow burn, as indifferent to human pain as always. In that strange, suspended moment, Hoichi sat perfectly still, his hands still digging into his knees, his body locked in the shape of obedience. Then the world came back, all at once. The head priest moved as if someone had cut a string that had been holding him in place. He half stumbled, half ran across the floor, calling Hoichi's name in a voice that tried to be calm and failed. The younger monks burst from their hiding places and followed, their sandals skidding on the boards. The sight that met them was worse than anything they had imagined when they had crept about in the graveyard. Hoichi sat there in front of the altar like a statue that had been badly damaged in a storm. His face was pale, under the lines of ink that still clung to his skin. Where his ears should have been, there were raw, ragged wounds, and blood still trickled steadily down both sides of his neck, soaking the collar of his robe, staining the sutras painted beneath. His mouth was pressed so tight that his lips had almost disappeared. His eyes, blind as always, stared at nothing, yet there was a look in them as if they had just seen something enormous and terrible on the inside of his skull. When the head priest touched his shoulder, the tension broke. Hoichi swayed sideways and would have fallen if they had not caught him. A strangled sound escaped him, not quite a cry, not quite a sigh, more like the first breath after being underwater too long. The old man eased him gently down to lie on the floor, cradling his ink-marked head in his lap, and began to speak to him in a steady, low tone, the way one speaks to a frightened animal or a child after a nightmare. "It is over," he said. "He is gone. You did well. You are here and alive. Breathe. That is what matters now. Breathe." The younger monks scattered to fetch what was needed. One ran for clean cloths. Another went to the medicine chest, where herbs and old remedies slept in their little wooden drawers. Someone brought water. They worked in a kind of quiet hurry, each gesture deliberate but quick, as if speed and care were not enemies but partners. Cleaning the wounds was not a pleasant task, but they did it. The blood had already clotted in places, dark and sticky. When the cloth touched the torn flesh, Hoichi flinched, even though he tried not to. He could not stop that. Pain ran from the sides of his head down into his jaw and neck in hot lines. But compared to the tearing itself, compared to the shock of bones and cartilage being wrenched away, This was almost bearable. His body knew that it was being helped, not hurt. The head priest worked with the focus of someone who has accepted that his earlier mistake has come at a great price and is determined not to make another. He applied an herbal paste that smelled strong and bitter, packed it gently around the wounds, and bound clean cloth over them in layers until the bleeding slowed and then stopped. His hands were old but steady. He had tended many injuries over the years, from kitchen cuts to falls, but never anything quite like this. When the worst of it was done, they carried Hoichi to his own small room and laid him on his bedding. The sutras on his skin were smudged in places now, blurred by sweat and blood, but they had served their purpose. The old man had no more use for them. He covered the musician with a light sheet and sat beside him, refusing to leave. The rest of the temple slowly woke to what had happened. Rumors moved down the corridors faster than feet. Some of the younger monks peered in from the doorway with wide eyes until they were shooed away. In the kitchen, someone wept quietly into the rice. In the garden, the cicadas sang as loudly as ever, utterly unconcerned. The sea out beyond the walls rolled and rolled, just as it had the day before and the year before, as if nothing about this small human drama could possibly interest it. For a long time, Hoichi hovered at the edge of sleep, dipping in and out. When he dozed, the pain in his head softened to a heavy ache. When he woke, it flared sharper and the room swam with it. He was aware in a dim way of the head priest's presence beside him, of a hand sometimes on his wrist counting his pulse, of a cup being held to his lips so that he could sip broth without moving too much. He did not speak. There were no words for what had happened that did not seem too small. On the second day, he tried to form a sentence and realized that the room was different, even beyond the throbbing in his skull. There was a new kind of silence lodged in his ears. He opened his mouth and said, "Reverend," and his voice sounded strange to him, thin and distant, as if it were coming from another person in another room. He raised a shaky hand to where his ears had been and felt the bandages there, bulky and rough. "I cannot hear properly," he said. The words seemed remote, as if he were repeating something someone else had told him. The head priest hesitated only a moment before answering. There was no point in mending this with lies. "No," he said, "you cannot. The spirit took both ears. Your hearing will not return. You will have to learn to live without it." Hoichi lay still. The information moved through him slowly, finding its place. He had grown up without sight and had learned to live with that sort of darkness. In place of it, he had cultivated other senses, the feel of air on his skin, the smell of rain on stone, the delicacy of sound in all its forms. Now one of those supports had been kicked away. He would not be able to hear the rustle of robes, the chuckle of water in a pot, the soft start of applause, the gasp that told him his story had struck home. His first thought, oddly, was of his biwa. "How will I play?" he whispered. The head priest looked at the instrument, leaning against the far wall of the room, the familiar curve of its body catching the light. "You have always felt the music as much as you heard it," he said. "Your hands know the strings. Your chest knows the way the sound lives inside you. Your ears will not be there to guide you anymore, but your memory and your touch will. The world will be quieter, that is true, but silence is not nothing. It has its own shape. You will learn it." It was not a promise that everything would be easy. It was simply a statement that life did not end here on this mat. For a long time, Hoichi lay with his eyes open, listening to the peculiar muffled half-world that remained to him. Each sound had to push itself through the ruined pathways to reach his mind, and it came out distorted, as if heard through water. A footstep was a dull thud, a voice was a blur of tone without clear edges. Yet they were there. That meant he was still in some kind of conversation with the living world, however altered. Days turned into weeks. Wounds close more slowly in reality than in stories, but they do close. The raw pain became an ache, then a tightness, then a set of scars that itched when the weather changed. The bandages grew lighter. At last there were only patches of tough new skin where ears had once been, smooth and slightly raised. When he ran his fingers over them, he felt a mixture of grief and a strange, calm pride. This was the cost of his escape. The ghosts had taken their proof, but they had not taken him. The story of what had happened did not stay inside the temple walls. Stories never do, especially when they involve blood and spirits and a musician. At first, the monks tried to keep the tale quiet, telling only those villagers who were closest to the temple and already trusted its odd work. But fishermen talk to one another while they mend nets, and women talk when they gather at the river to wash clothes, and travelers who stop for the night like to swap tales for the price of a cup of sake. Soon the town knew about the blind musician whose ears had been torn off by a ghost in the main hall of Amidaji. Some of the details blurred and shifted, as they always do. In one version, 100 lights had filled the room like a storm of fireflies. In another, the retainer had left wet footprints on the floor that did not dry for 7 days. In yet another, the statue of Amida had lowered its eyes for the first time in centuries to watch. The essential points remained. Hoichi had been singing for the spirits of the Taira. They had tried to claim him. The temple had intervened. The ears had been taken. The man had lived. With the spreading of the story came visitors. At first, they arrived out of curiosity. A farmer and his wife from a few villages away who had heard about the earless musician and wanted to see if such a person truly existed. A merchant passing through on his way to a larger town, drawn by the promise of a good tale to tell his customers. They left offerings of rice and coins at the altar, bowed to the Buddha, and asked timidly if they might also greet the famous Hoichi. The head priest was cautious. For a while he kept Hoichi away from these visitors, concerned that the attention would exhaust him. But the musician himself, once he had found his balance again, asked to meet them. "If they have come all this way," he said, "it is not just to stare at the place where my ears used to be. They want to hear something. My life is not the interesting part. The story is." So they brought him out to the veranda on quiet afternoons and evenings. He sat there with his back to a familiar pillar, his biwa resting across his knees, and listened to the strange new sound of guests. Their greetings reached him as a soft blur, but he could still feel the way the air shifted around them when they sat down. He could still smell the dust of the road on their clothes, the faint sweetness of dried fruit carried as a snack, the sharp tang of the sea on the fishermen. When they asked, shyly, if he would play, he said yes. His hands moved over the strings, finding places they had visited so often that they no longer needed the guide of sound. At first, playing without hearing his own music clearly was like walking through a familiar house in a dream. His fingers knew where the tables and doorways were, but the walls seemed to have shifted slightly. He made mistakes. He adjusted. Slowly, he learned to feel the vibration of the strings in his bones instead of in his ears. The body is stubborn and clever. It finds new pathways if you give it time. As the weeks turned into months, his playing changed. Those who had known his music before and after sometimes said that the later songs had a different weight. There was more quiet in them, more space between the notes, as if he had brought some of the graveyard silence back with him and woven it into the melodies. The scenes of battle and drowning were still vivid, but now they carried a tenderness that was sharper because it had been paid for in flesh. When he sang about the child emperor sinking beneath the waves, listeners noticed that he spoke the boy's name with an intimacy that sounded like the naming of a neighbor. Word traveled farther. The story of Hoichi reached not just nearby towns but cities along the coast. Merchants carried it in their mouths as they moved from port to port. Pilgrims added Mythology to their routes. Some came to pray for their own lost dead, believing that a temple that had stood between a man and vengeful spirits might have special power. Some came purely for the story, because human beings are drawn to tales of the uncanny, the way moths are drawn to lamplight. Before long, the blind musician found himself sitting before more and more varied audiences. There were simple peasants who saved coins for months to make the journey. There were retired warriors with old scars under their robes who listened with faces that gave nothing away. There were refined ladies in layered silk who covered their mouths with their sleeves when the tears came, hoping no one would see. Once or twice, there were officials from the capital, their voices smooth and cultivated, who spoke of the tale of the clan as if they were discussing a play that had closed long ago and been forgotten, only to be revived unexpectedly. Through it all, Hoichi remained small and quiet, a man with no eyes for the visible world and no ears in the usual sense, yet with a presence that filled the space around him when he played. The nickname that had begun as a piece of practical description became a sort of title. People called him Hoichi the Earless, and the name carried not just pity but an odd respect. It sounded like the name of a minor spirit or a guardian carved on a temple gate. The monks of Mythology adjusted too. At first they hovered around Hoichi with a protective air, as if a gust of wind might knock him over. As his strength returned and his routine resumed, they relaxed. They learned to tap him on the shoulder or the arm to get his attention, instead of calling his name from across the courtyard. They took care that no sudden loud noises shattered the fragile world of his new hearing. They told him, when he asked, how many people had come that day, what they looked like, what sort of offerings they had left. The temple itself grew busier, and the donations that arrived helped repair old beams and buy more rice. On some evenings, when the visitors had gone and the light was fading, the head priest and Hoichi sat together on the veranda, as they had in the earlier, quieter days. The sea out beyond the temple wall made its continuous, patient sound. The old man would sometimes say, almost to himself, "They have more reason to rest now. Their story has been told again. That helps." Hoichi would tilt his head slightly, as if listening for something behind the sound of the waves. Then he would nod. He did not need anyone to tell him that the spirits of the Tyra still lingered in the strait. There were nights when the air seemed to carry a cold that did not belong to the season, when lights bobbed out on the water in ways that did not match any fisherman's lantern. But he felt, or perhaps simply believed, that whatever claim they had on him had been settled. They had taken what they needed. He had kept what he needed. Between them, something like a balance had been reached. Years do what they always do. They moved on. The story of Hoichi and his missing ears slid into the rich crowd of other stories that people told each other when the chores were done and the sake bottle was open. Somewhere in the capital, someone recited the tale and someone else wrote it down. Later still, a foreigner who loved Japan and its old ghosts would come across it and preserve it in his own language so that other people, far from the strait where the battle had once raged, could picture a blind musician sitting among the graves and singing to the dead. At Amidaji, life settled into a new pattern. The temple bells continued to ring at the appointed times. The monks tended their gardens and chanted for the souls of the departed. The sea rolled and rolled, and in the middle of it all, sometimes on warm nights when the air was heavy, and sometimes on crisp mornings when the light was sharp, there was a man with no ears who held a biwa in his hands and drew from it the sounds of a battle that had ended centuries before, but refused to be forgotten. If you were to stand today on the shore at Shimonoseki, where the water runs between Honshu and Kyushu, you would see the strait that ended an age. The currents still twist and pull with their old stubbornness, and ships still cross from one side to the other, but somewhere, under all that traffic, lies the memory of the Genpei War. That war, fought in the late 12th century between the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan, was not just a quarrel between rival families. It was a slow earthquake in the way the country understood power. Samurai were moving from the edges of the court to the center. Emperors and retired emperors and cloistered emperors all tangled their wishes together. Armies marched up and down the islands for years, burning, looting, praying, and dying, until at last it all narrowed into the Battle of Dan, no Yura out on that fast and unforgiving water. There, in a morning that turned quickly to chaos, the Taira fleet was broken. Arrows darkened the sky, ships rammed other ships, and when the Minamoto victory became clear, the Taira leaders chose to sink with their emperor rather than be dragged ashore in chains. The boy who went into the sea that day, Emperor Antoku, was only 6 years old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, too young to have caused any of it. Temples and shrines sprang up afterward the way weeds spring up in a burned field. Amidaji, which later became Akama Shrine, was one of those places where grief tried to take on a shape that could be prayed to. Stone markers and wooden tablets carried the names of drowned nobles and anonymous warriors alike. For people nearby, the war was not just dates in a chronicle. It was something the sea returned to them piece by piece in the form of bodies and broken armor and strange stories. Fishermen began talking about crabs whose shells seemed to bear tiny human faces. Lanterns on calm nights appeared where no boats floated. The wind carried what sounded like distant drums. In that world, a blind musician sitting among the graves and telling the story of the clan did not feel like fantasy. It felt like a natural extension of what was already there. Biwa priests like Hoichi were living archives. They had no libraries but their own memories, and their instruments were like doors. When they plucked the strings, the past walked out. People who could not read heard in those chants the only detailed account of the war they would ever receive. It is no wonder that listeners, living or dead, gathered when such a singer began. The protection given to Hoichi, those sutras painted on his skin, belongs to a different thread in the same tapestry. In Buddhist thought, words are not only explanation, they are also shelter. A verse is both meaning and shield. Writing holy text on the body may sound strange to modern ears, but for monks who spent their days copying scripture, it made deep sense. If books could hold back ignorance and fear, then perhaps skin covered in the same characters could hold back spirits caught in their own anger. At a Karma shrine today, visitors can still find the traces of that belief. There are halls dedicated to the Taira dead and to Emperor Antoku. There is a statue of a small man with a biwa in his arms and a calm expression on his face, his ears smooth and flat. People leave coins, bow, and stand quietly for a moment, thinking of the way a story told with conviction can keep memories alive for centuries. Some of them probably do not know all the details of the Genpei War, and that is all right. They know that somewhere between history and ghost story, between tide and stone, there was a musician named Hoichi, and that his song was strong enough that we are still talking about it now.